Your pain has potential and your rage can be used for good, but that's not what you've been taught. If you're anything like me, you were told how to bury your emotions deep beneath the surface of inauthenticity and then to act surprised when you snap at your loved ones with a sudden burst of rage or some kind of passive-aggressive remark, or otherwise turning all of that anger inwards and self-sabotaging your own health, your own ambitions, and your own relationships with destructive behaviors. But we don't need to choose between either of these repressed polarities and continue to be sick with our own anger. Anger can be transformed into something which is beneficial. Anger is often something which is framed as a purely destructive emotion which will tear apart family, friends, and the world at large, but destructiveness can become generative. We can learn to use our anger to heal this damaged world, and in this video I'm going to be showing you some very raw and visceral shadow work to get behind one of the most repressed emotions in our society. And I'm going to be doing it with this wonderful question that I'm bringing up on the screen right now, an advanced question, and there's multiple layers of nuance, so please join me for the next 20 minutes or so as we really do a genuine shadow work exploration of what I believe to be one of the most festering and resentment-building series of emotional sensations, which unfortunately we just don't talk about. So let's start talking about it with this question. Question asked, can you provide a book recommendation on dealing with unexpressed rage? I'm noticing as I dive into internal family systems and somatic experiencing, oftentimes a lower energy state will yield to a higher energy state through the recognition of anger. And then taking a break here, there's a few more sentences talking about the symptomatic surging of a sudden well of anger that seemed to erupt like a volcano, and this person's already going through the somatic processing and the parts-based processing through books like Internal Family Systems Therapy, which is a parts work-based approach to feeling and healing, and then in an unspoken voice, somatic experiencing, Peter Levine. These are two different approaches. You can bring them together in something like somatic internal family systems therapy. I've recommended these books multiple times on the channel. You can read all three of them in your own time. This person's already going into that advanced understanding where they've got the symptomatic band-aid solutions towards their own repressed anger. They have some degree of sophistication about the internal psychic networks where that anger actually comes from. But then this final part of the question is really where I want to focus, because there's many ways to take this, but look at this final question here. How can they get a meaningful stand in their life and not just routine maintenance? Any thoughts on further reading or appropriate outlets? This is the real invitation of healing your repressed anger. I don't want you to be in just symptom management. Yes, it's wonderful if you're healing your repressed anger and you're at the early stages of admitting that actually your parents weren't very good to you, that relationship wasn't very good for you, that boss wasn't very good to you, whatever the thing is that you're angry about, maybe society at large, maybe some issue that you care about in particular, you're allowing that anger to come through in a very real way for the first time. This video might not be the one for you. We're talking about the level after the acceptance that you have the anger, and then you actively start working with that anger to prevent the destructiveness in your day-to-day life. How do you use it for something greater? This questioner wanted to make a stand for something, and that's really about empowerment. Because if I'm ever working with someone who's got deeply repressed anger, they'll usually mask with a face of apathy. They'll seem depressed. They'll be like, yeah, my dad kind of beat me up a bit, and my mum wasn't really there, but it's nothing, I don't care. Or, yeah, she did cheat on me with both of my best friends and then took my car, but it's fine. Or, oh yeah, he did literally do that, whatever the story is, a dead face, and oh yeah, it's all fine. And even as I'm pretending, I feel the tightness in my throat because I'm bloody lying. I'm not being real with the emotions. I'm not a girl whose boyfriend has cheated on him or cheated on her. trying to make examples. I'm playing around, literal examples of me going into the energy, being a bit theatrical for the sake of demonstration, and I can feel the lie in my throat. My mouth's gone a bit dry. Somatically, in this moment, and this is again where you look at things like somatic internal family systems, I've done enough inner work and enough embodied shadow work at this point in my personal healing journey that when I start to say a lie, I can feel that I lose saliva. I can feel that I have constriction. I can feel different expressions in my face and my facial muscles. I can feel that my guts twist up into inauthentic knots. And people don't realize that when they've been doing that for years and years and years. The first stage of working with repressed anger is to realize that you're lying to yourself, that you're actually still angry. If you're in that stage where you're pretending that you've forgiven someone, or you're pretending you're okay with something, and you're doing the very smart bypassing strategy, that kept you safe for now, but this is maybe a moment in this video where you admit to yourself you are still angry. Women tend to repress that anger a little bit deeper than men. They'll tend to go for the crying kind of response. Women tend to be easier with tears, and men tend to be easier with anger. But men have their own different anger issues. Men tend to repress their tears a lot more. Women tend to repress their anger a lot more. But the fundamental thread between both men and women when it comes to repressed anger is you have to be honest with yourself, and you can find that in your body. If I'm working with a client who doesn't realize that their body is sending them signals of inauthenticity, it's my job to show them just what's happening and to say, hey, look, your throat's closing up, your tone just changed there, I think something else might be happening. Are you sure you're not angry about this? And eventually, over the course of multiple months, skipping through the entire therapeutic process of that initial awakening of anger, they start to get all of that energy back. Because if you're taking someone who's in depressed, apathetic energy, and then you bring out the anger, maybe they've struggled with addiction, maybe they've got some kind of self-harming situations that have happened in the past, or unfortunately still in the present, we need to take that anger that's turned inwards, we need to take the anger that's frozen into a cold, apathetic shutdown and find a way for it to express without it being destructive to the people around them. So how do you do that? Well, the person who asked today's question said that they're already symptomatically self-managing by doing something like going to the gym and hitting it hard with the weights, or otherwise going into intense dance sessions and really dancing off, really letting that anger come through and finding a way to reanimate. And even now, as I bring a bit more animation into my body, it feels much better. My feet feel solidified on the floor because I'm not playing the victim. I'm empowered. I'm standing up, and I feel like I've got more potential options. Because if you're crouched in like this, and you're slumped down, and you're lying to yourself and you can't breathe, you've lost the ability to make change. You're not going to be able to heal this damaged world and actually make a contribution to society if you're disconnected from your own heart, and your heart has this fog of anger kind of seething and bubbling and fermenting in a very toxic way. You are bound to get sickness if you let this continue for enough years. And if you ever want to make a connection towards why people have inflammation diseases, usually something like arthritis, for example, and inflammatory disease, if you ever do therapeutic work with someone who suffers from arthritis, in 9 out of 10, maybe even 9.5 out of 10 situations, they've got deeply repressed anger. All of that heat, all of that energy, maybe it's not a medical perspective, but there's an interesting pattern that you'll notice. People who suffer from inflammation tend to have inflamed emotions, which are still here rather than being let out. So what's the next step? How can we turn that awareness that I've got this flame inside of me into something which can actually heal the world rather than destroy the world? Firstly, you need to separate out that destructiveness and generativity are not the same thing, and anger isn't one catch-all phrase that covers all of the particular niches and micro compartments of the emotion of intense energy. Because if you take away the word anger, what you're actually working with is an upward surge of expressive force, right? You're not working with cold, shut down energy. Just think about this. It might be out there language, breaking down an emotion based on the somatic experience of anger. When most people get angry, their chest gets red, their face gets red, there's more expressiveness. If they're going from a cold response, a cold depressed response, they get angry, you get hot, Some people get clammy hands, other people get really intense with their jaw and they start literally growling, or not literally, maybe they do if they get angry enough, they literally start growling. But there's heat, there's energy, there's force, there's power. More has been added. And if more is there, it needs to go outwards or it needs to be integrated. But usually, unfortunately, more of an intermediate level conversation, when you're on the healing pathway or even a spiritual pathway, you will try and bypass into integration before you've learned how to healthily express the anger. It's not enough to breathe it in. And even there, calm down my energy. I'm making a video on anger and I'm being expressive forwards. I can breathe it back in, calm it down. Jordan's a little bit less intense. I've learned how to do that. I've learned how to work with my own anger, but that's just a symptomatic micro moment. It's not the bigger picture. If you've got deep wounding, deep pain, and deep resentment, that anger is going to stick around for years, which means you need something that you can devote the anger to for years. Because here's a behind the scenes trick. This is the invitation of the video, how to work with your repressed anger. You need to care about something which the anger can be used for. And for me, personally, one of the major ways that I used my own repressed anger was in fitness and bodybuilding and generally improving my athleticism. But I would be straight up lying to you if I didn't look around this library and realize that actually a lot of the reading that I did was very angry reading. This doesn't mean that I was reading a book like Somatic Internal Family Systems Therapy and really getting angry and ripping apart the pages as I go through it. But I had that aggressiveness, because aggressiveness and assertiveness, they're very close to each other, and you can be aggressive with your self-education. You can also be aggressive with your work, but it doesn't mean it has to be destructive. You can aggressively serve a generative aim, which is maybe too complex a language for saying, if you care passionately, passion, there's that word there. Passion comes in on the backside of anger, and this is why if you're in a toxic relationship and suddenly you start shouting at each other and then just like that, you're tumbling in the sheets together. We confuse these emotions all the time. Anger can go into passion very quickly, but let's not make it an unconscious shadow dynamic. I've been exploring this at length in my course, the Shadow Work Library. Actually, even within this playlist that you're seeing right now, you can see the link in the description. I've got a 35-minute video directly from the course about how to bioenergetically work with your anger and heal yourself in a very practical way. But don't be caught in that shadow dynamic where anger suddenly goes into passion and it seems like it's out of your control. You can choose your lane of assertive, aggressive, and at times angry or rageful expression without breaking through, going over, and otherwise hurting people in the environment. And what this looks like in practical sense, what does it actually look like? For me personally, with the example of reading, how do I read angrily? On a certain morning, let's say 1 year ago, I would be reading a book and I'd disagree with the opinions of the author, and I'd sometimes mutter to myself like a crazy person, I can't believe they'd write that. And then I'd really look in. I'm not completely possessed by the anger, and I'm not going to go and send them an angry email. Of course, many of the people in this library, they are no longer here, so I have to send some kind of etheric email across the astral web to the afterlife, whatever that might mean. I can't do that. I'm not going to literally express the anger, but that feeling of frustration, that desire to penetrate and push through, that expressive surge of energy gets tied in with my focus, and I can read for hours and hours from that state. When I'm angry, I don't make it negative. I see it as an opportunity to use energy, maybe from a place that's still unconscious, maybe some deep well of rage, a chip on my shoulder, some kind of pit of fiery intensity that I still haven't accessed. It's there. I don't need to know the exact origin, pinpoint precision. All I have is the opportunity when it bubbles up, midway through that shadow healing journey, it's bubbling up, it's erupting. I can either choose to symptomatically release that with gym or with some breathing exercise or maybe some grounding activity, but I wouldn't want to rob myself of the therapeutic potential of using that anger for good. And I can only know where to put that anger if I've already established a lane. You can read, you can serve. If you've ever seen a great humanitarian worker, maybe someone who's working in a conflict zone and they're delivering life-saving aid to people who've either been through some kind of civil war or maybe a natural disaster. There's a few different conflicts on the earth right now at the time of recording. How do you think a humanitarian worker gets through those difficult days? How do you get through a day where you're pulling children out of rubble? How do you get through a day where yet again you're walking past a row of body bags? You can shut down, and you can get depressed, and you can lose hope, or you can get angry about it. Anger is a better choice in that kind of stressful situation. And if you ever read the memoirs of humanitarian workers, which is something I did back at university, one of my specializations was the history of humanitarian intervention. And I spent a year looking at these documents and first-hand accounts of what it's like on the inside, psychologically and subjectively, to be in those high-pressure situations, because I thought, a little bit of personal story, that I was going to go into something like Doctors Without Borders after university. I took basically that same energetic impression of, I've got a lot of power, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration to try and make this world better. And rather than doing it in a conflict zone in a foreign nation, I took the same fundamental energy, and here's an entire YouTube channel, and here's the client work that I do behind closed doors. It's still fueled by that same drive that this isn't good enough. I'm nowhere near the level of responsibility and stress and the level of admiration that I have towards those people who are doing that very difficult work in crisis situations, but I still can tap into that frustration and let it create loving videos. In this video in particular, see, I'm changing my energy. I'm playing with anger as I'm expressing the anger, and now I've just dropped it. I've dropped the anger out my system, a bit more of the kind of smiley energy in my cheeks, and bringing a bit more into my heart, rather than being down in my guts and feeling like I'm forcing through something. I'm still using the same energy source. With just a second of awareness, I can make it more compassionate. There are so many opportunities, but all of that higher level, turning anger into compassion and finding a way to turn it into a reliable fuel source like a nuclear core that sometimes surges up and has a sudden burst of activity, but is always humming in the background, ready for some kind of new possibility, that all comes later. Fundamentally, one invitation for this video: you need to set a lane for that energy to flow down. And also accept, if you've had a particularly crappy childhood, you had a particularly difficult relationship, or a certain traumatic situation that was completely wrong, something happened to you, whatever it might be, I'm not going to say the specifics. If you let that anger come up, and you don't have a lane for expression, and you haven't set aside the time to do genuine shadow work and try and find a way to turn darkness into light, you will almost inevitably turn that inwards in terms of self-sabotage, vice, and destruction, or be hostile, abusive, or otherwise destructive towards people that you supposedly care about. And I wouldn't want that for you. It's a very heavy warning, but it's inevitable. Unexpressed anger will fester, and unexpressed anger can fester for only so long before it will erupt in an unconscious fashion. You cannot bypass the emotion if it's there for good reason, but you can choose a lane for generative new possibilities. That's how you work with it. I chose to build this library, build a YouTube channel, and build a client practice. You could do some other humanitarian work. Even if you have a spiritual incentive, you can take that frustration at the soullessness of the world and all of the degeneracy and hostility and conflict and misunderstanding that's in the world right now, and turn it towards an incentive to create an ashram or a meditation center or an intentional community. And you take that anger symptomatically. Imagine this: you buy some land with a few of your friends and potential colleagues, and on that moment where you see something in the news and it upsets you, you go out into the garden, and for 3 hours you clear out the bushes and the brambles with the anger in your hands for a positive outcome of clearing some space to plant an orchard. It's very symbolic. It's maybe a bit of a silly metaphor, but I've had moments like that myself, especially when I spent 2 years traveling around on various farms. I was doing my own healing work, and if in the morning I access some kind of memory or some kind of narrative of frustration and abuse or betrayal, whatever it might have been, bring that energy into my hands, express it symptomatically in the immediate day-by-day basis, but know that you're contributing to something beautiful. That is the sweet spot to work inside. It's up to you to decide your lane, but please do not go without creating that structure. Your anger will turn sour, and you will fall into this mainstream narrative of anger always being destructive, and if you stay there, you will continue to repress, and I guarantee it will blow up relationships, business connections, and harm your own health. I don't want you to be arthritic, inflamed, have gut and digestive issues, have issues with your throat and tightness and breathing constrictions, because the anger wasn't properly utilized. Doesn't have to be a curse. If you do want to go deeper on this journey with me, then join me over in the next episode of the Shadow Series playlist, where we're going to be talking about conscious relationships, which is very much the opposite of an unconscious, anger-based relationship. It all ties together. I'll see you over there.